The crimson dust of the New Mexico territory rose in angry plumes as Billy the Kid and his companions rode toward the desolate settlement of Red Creek. It was the sweltering summer of 1881, and the name William H. Bonney already echoed across the Wild West like the toll of a bell, a reckless young outlaw who played by his own twisted code of honor. The heat shimmered, blurring the low adobe buildings of the town, making the entire place look like a troubled mirage. The only sounds were the weary clop of hooves, the creak of leather, and the incessant dry whisper of the desert wind. Billy, lean and deceptively boyish beneath his wide-brimmed Stetson, rode point. Beside him was Tom O'Folliard, his loyal shadow, his hand resting near the familiar grip of his Colt .45. Bringing up the rear were Charlie Baudre, the silent, deadly sharpshooter, and José Chavez y Chavez, whose knowledge of the trails and arroyos was as vast as the desert itself. They were looking for a fresh waterhole and a safe place to lay low after a successful cattle raid. Not trouble, but trouble had a way of finding Billy. Red Creek was a ghost of a town. The main street was deserted save for a lone dog gnawing on a bone. The saloon door was shut tight, and a silence, heavy and unnatural, sat like a vulture on the rooftops. As they slowed their horses near the livery stable, José pointed with a sun-chapped finger toward a small, battered ranch house on the outskirts. A small crowd of Mexican-American pioneers stood outside, their faces etched with a grief too deep for tears. A makeshift wooden cross stood leaning in the parched earth nearby. "Something wrong here, kid," Tom murmured, shifting his weight in the saddle. Too quiet for a Saturday. Billy dismounted. The sound of his spurs sharp and metallic in the dead air. He walked toward the group, his movements loose, almost casual, masking the lightning speed of his draw. The crowd parted, revealing an older man clutching a worn Bible and a young woman, perhaps 18 years old, standing rigidly by the door. Her eyes, wide and unnervingly clear, stared straight ahead, yet saw nothing. Billy immediately sensed the raw, unavenged sorrow in the place. "I'm Billy," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man twice his age. "What's the trouble, amigo?" The older man, Elijah, swallowed hard. "They took him, sir. They took old Josiah Clay. He was a good man, just a farmer. They wanted his plot near the river, said the title wasn't right." He gestured vaguely toward the girl. "His daughter, Ilara, she's all that's left." Billy turned to Ilara. She was slender, dressed in simple, dirt-stained cotton, but her posture spoke of an unbreakable spirit. She was blind, a fact that hit Billy with a coldness that cut through the desert heat. "Ma'am," Billy said, tipping his hat, "tell me who did this." Ilara's voice was clear, yet tremulous with suppressed rage. "It was the sheriff's men, Senor Bonney. Deputy Slocum and his brute, Jessup. The sheriff himself sent them. They beat him for hours, trying to make him sign. When he refused, Slocum put a bullet in him right in front of me. I couldn't see it, but I heard every sound. The thud of the shovel, the sickening crack of the whip, the bang of the Colt. The sheriff calls it law. I call it murder." She paused, taking a ragged breath. Her sightless eyes seemed to look into his very soul. "They say you're a killer, William Bonney. They say you only care for yourself and your cattle. But they also say you don't abide a coward or a bully. My father sought the law, and the law killed him. I can't see the face of the man who can do this, but I can hear the man who can stop him. I beg you, not for justice, but for vengeance." The word hung in the air, potent and dark. Billy felt the familiar spark ignite in his chest. He'd lived his life outside the law, but he drew a hard line at the abuse of power against the defenseless. A sheriff who used his badge to steal land and murder an old farmer was worse than any bandit. He was a hypocrite and a stain on the frontier. Billy placed his hand, calloused from years on the trail and holding an iron, on the small wooden cross. The silence of the gathered mourners was the only answer. "Easy, Mom," Billy said, his voice low and firm. "Justice is a risky thing in this territory, but some debts need paying in lead. Tell me where the sheriff makes his nest." He looked back at his gang. Tom and Charlie were already tightening the cinches on their saddles. Jose's eyes, keen and sharp, scanned the perimeter. They didn't need to be told. They knew Billy had just taken on a fight that wasn't theirs, but that they would see through to the bitter end. The gang had a code. They rode together. They fought together. As Ilara began to describe the sheriff's fortified ranch, the High Mesa Citadel, Jose suddenly gave a sharp, low whistle. He pointed to the rooftops of the general store and the saloon. Two men, small against the harsh light, were scrambling down, too quickly, trying to blend into the shadows. They were carrying repeating rifles. "Spies, kid," Jose said, reloading his Winchester. "The sheriff already knows we're here, or he's watching the girl. They'll be riding back to tell their boss what they saw. We just made our first enemy." Billy gave a slow, dangerous smile. The tension in Red Creek had just been replaced by the electrifying buzz of impending conflict. "Well, mi amigos," Billy drawled, pulling his rifle from the scabbard, the metal warm from the sun. "Looks like the sheriff decided to save us a trip." The gang quickly mounted up, the only sound the metallic clack of lever-action rifles being prepared. The desert had fallen silent again, waiting for the coming storm. The four men rode hard until sunset, pushing their horses into a narrow, winding canyon 20 miles west of Red Creek. The red rock walls soared above them, offering concealment from the ever-present eyes of the sheriff's network. The air, though cooler, was thick with the scent of sage and damp earth from a hidden spring they knew well. They dismounted in a shadowed alcove, the light of the setting sun painting the canyon tops in streaks of orange and blood red. Tomo Folliard, ever pragmatic, started the fire. "Billy, that sheriff ain't gonna sit still. He's got the whole county in his pocket, probably pays the marshal a handsome silver dollar just to look the other way. We walk in there, we walk into a hornet's nest." Billy was meticulously cleaning his dual Colt 45 revolvers, the nickel plating gleaming in the firelight. The fire's glow reflected in his young, intense eyes. "That sheriff, his name is Calderon, a big man, a former bounty hunter with more greed than honor. He's been carving up this territory for months. Josiah Clay was just a footnote in his ledger, but Ilara Clay gave him a name, and now he's our problem." Doc Scurlock, who always carried a tattered book on strategy alongside his shotgun, crouched by a map he'd scratched onto the dust. "The Citadel is 3 hours from here, high on Mesa Grande. It's fortified, likely with a dozen or more hired guns, the kind of men who shoot first and never ask questions. Calderon won't be there himself. He'll be in the county seat, running his operation from a saloon or the jailhouse." Jose Chavez y Chavez, a man who moved like a ghost through the landscape, chimed in. "The two spies, Slocum and Jessup, they're the murderers. Ilara's story matches what I've heard about Slocum, a man who loves the sound of his own power. They'll be the first to reach the Citadel, thinking they've warned the sheriff." Billy snapped the cylinders back into his Colts. "Slocum and Jessup are the debt. Calderon is the interest. We take Slocum and Jessup first, and we make it loud. We want Calderon to come out of his hole and see what's waiting for him." The plan began to form, precise and deadly, based on their individual strengths. Charlie Boder was tasked with the reconnaissance. "Charlie, you're the best tracker we got. You're going up to the Citadel, find out who's inside, where the lookouts are, and how they get their supplies. Don't get seen. You're a shadow until I call you in." Charlie, a man of few words, simply nodded, adjusted his wide leather belt, and silently melted into the darkness, blending with the rocky terrain. "Tom, Doc, you two take the main road. Intercept Slocum and Jessup before they reach the mesa. If they get inside, it's a siege, and we don't have the time or the ammo for that. Make sure they know who sent you." Tom checked his shotgun, the clack-clack of the action sounding like a heartbeat. "What about you, Billy?" "I'll wait for Charlie's signal. I want to know exactly what kind of welcome Calderon has planned. Jose, you stay with me. You know every crack in these rocks. You'll be my eyes and ears." The gang spent the next few hours in grim preparation. They checked their Winchester rifles, cleaning the barrels and ensuring their ammunition was plentiful. Doc Scurlock sharpened his hunting knife, a nervous but calculating energy about him. The tension was palpable, a thick, almost electric stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. They knew that facing the sheriff meant challenging the only semblance of legal order in the territory, a move that would immediately bring down federal marshals and bounties, 10 times their current price. Doc looked at Billy, his face serious. "Kid, this ain't a cattle rustling. This is war against a badge. We get caught, we hang." Billy, who had killed men for less, shrugged, the movement fluid and youthful. "A badge don't mean a man's honorable, Doc. Slocum killed a blind girl's father for a piece of ground. That ain't law. That's just a bully with a shiny piece of metal. And bullies gotta be put down." Before dawn, Charlie returned, his face grim. "The sheriff's got 12 men up there, kid. Most of them are cheap hired guns. But the second man, El Lobo, is a professional killer. They're expecting Slocum and Jessup back before noon, and they're holding 2 men prisoner in the cellar, pioneers who stood up to Calderon before Clay did. The stakes had risen. Now it wasn't just vengeance, it was a rescue." Billy looked at Tom and Doc. The first target was no longer just an ambush. It was a necessary and immediate elimination to keep the plan in motion. He pointed toward the trail. "Saddle up, boys. We've got a date with 2 murderers and a long ride ahead of us. We hit Slocum and Jessup on the trail, silence them quick, then we move on the mesa. Remember Ilara, remember Josiah Clay. No prisoners until we find those other 2 men." Tom and Doc mounted their horses and rode out, disappearing into the lingering dark before sunrise. The sound of their horses' hooves faded quickly, leaving Billy and Jose alone in the canyon. The sun was just beginning to peek over the canyon rim, and the day was already promising to be a scorching inferno of lead and dust. "Let the game begin, mi hermano," Jose muttered, pulling his scarf higher over his face. Billy leveled his gaze toward the east, toward the approaching footsteps of the killers. He was still a boy, barely past 20, but in his eyes was the chilling emptiness of a man who had chosen his path and his enemies. Tom O'Folliard and Doc Scurlock positioned themselves at the mouth of the Devil's Pass, a treacherous, narrow stretch of trail where the red rock walls squeezed the path to a tight funnel. The air was still and thick with the scent of dry earth. Doc crouched behind a boulder, his double-barreled shotgun resting on the rock, its barrels aimed. Tom was higher up, ready with his Winchester Model 1873. They waited in a silence broken only by the nervous clink of a loose horseshoe on Tom's horse, tethered a safe distance away. The first sign of the targets was a faint cloud of dust, followed by the muffled jingle of spurs. "Here they come, Doc," Tom whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger guard, just like the kid said. Deputy Slocum, a man whose official badge looked ridiculous pinned to his sweat-stained buckskin jacket, led the way. He was talking and laughing loudly with Jessup, a massive brute of a man whose face was a roadmap of brawls and bad decisions. They were riding without caution, feeling secure under the protection of Sheriff Calderon. As the 2 entered the narrowest point of the pass, Slocum was mid-sentence, and the blind chica couldn't even point a finger. "Best damn land steal I ever—" Tom's Winchester roared twice. The bullets didn't miss. Slocum's horse screamed, rearing up and throwing the deputy hard against the rock face. Jessup, less fortunate, took a slug in the shoulder, his colt dropping uselessly into the dirt as he tumbled from his saddle. The ambush was brutal and instantaneous. Slocum lay stunned, his breathing shallow. Jessup scrambled for his dropped gun, his face contorted in pain and fear. "Don't move, you cowardly son of a bitch!" Doc's voice cut through the ringing silence. Doc stood up, the shotgun aimed squarely at Jessup's chest, his face set in a look of grim determination. "That's a full charge of buckshot, partner. You want a piece of that?" Jessup froze. The raw, primal fear had replaced his brute arrogance. Tom slid down the embankment, his rifle still trained on Slocum. "You're Deputy Slocum, the man who killed Josiah Clay in front of his blind daughter. We're here on behalf of justice, and her name is Billy the Kid." The name, Billy the Kid, drained the color from Slocum's face. The boastful murderer suddenly looked small and pathetic. They dragged Slocum to a rock, tying his hands tightly behind him. Jessup, bleeding heavily from his shoulder, was trussed up beside him. "Start talking," Tom demanded, kicking dust onto Slocum's face. "How many men on the mesa? What's the plan?" Slocum spat blood. "Go to hell, outlaw." Doc calmly reloaded his shotgun, the metallic sound amplifying the tension. He leveled it at Jessup's head. "The kid wants to know about the prisoners, the ones you took. You tell us, or your big friend here gets a full second load. Which is it, Deputy?" Jessup, terrified, broke immediately. "Two men! Two! Old man Tanner and his boy, Luke. Calderon wants them to sign over their mining claim. They're in the cellar below the main cabin, but it's a trap, I tell you. Calderon knows you're coming. He left orders to blow the place if you ride in too heavy." Slocum glared at Jessup, rage overriding his fear. "You damn fool! Blow it?" Tom's voice was dangerously low. "With the hostages inside?" "He don't care," Jessup sobbed. "He just wants the land. He said if we see any trouble, we light the fuse. The dynamite is under the cellar. It's all primed." The news hit them like a physical blow. Calderon was not just a greedy sheriff. He was a cold-blooded killer, willing to sacrifice his own men and two innocent hostages just to ensure his secrets and his claim were buried forever. Doc stared at Slocum, his face registering a disgust deeper than any anger. "You killed an old man, and you'd let two others burn to save your boss. You're lower than the dirt we're standing on." The immediate plan had to change. The assault on the mesa was now a desperate race against time. Tom knelt before Slocum, pulling a piece of the dead Josiah Clay's worn cotton shirt from his pocket. He held it up to the deputy's face. "This is for Josiah Clay and for his daughter's vengeance," Tom said, his voice flat and final. He stood up, drew his Colt, and shot Slocum once, cleanly in the head. The sound of the gunshot echoed off the canyon walls, a grim report of finality. Doc, without a word, delivered the same justice to Jessup. They were no court, but in the desolate lawlessness of the territory, the justice of the gun was often the only one that worked. Tom retrieved the deputy's badge. "The kid will need this for Calderon." They didn't waste time on burial. They gathered their horses and rode hard back to the rendezvous point. The silence of the canyon, now heavy with the smell of gunpowder and the raw burden of the swift, brutal justice they had delivered. They had eliminated the two primary killers, but the revelation of Calderon's trap, the dynamite, meant the final showdown would be a desperate, explosive affair. The assault on Sheriff Calderon's high mesa citadel began just as the sun dipped, casting long, menacing shadows across the desolate ranch. Billy the Kid, wearing Slocum's sheriff's badge over his own shirt, led the charge. The posse of outlaws was a compact, deadly unit: Billy, Doc, Tom, and Jose. Their goal was simple: get to the cellar, neutralize the fuse, and take down Calderon's remaining men before the place turned into a fireball. Charlie Bowdre, positioned high on a rocky ridge a half-mile away, had already provided the necessary distraction. 2 sticks of dynamite, set near the ranch's outer stable, had exploded, sending horses scattering and drawing 4 of Calderon's men out toward the noise. They were quickly and quietly cut down by Charlie's unerring Winchester from the distance. "Now, Doc!" Billy yelled. Doc Scurlock, the strategist, was already in motion. Using the cover of a dry creek bed, he sprinted toward the main cabin's east wall, Tom providing cover fire. Jose, agile and fast, circled around to the kitchen entrance, ready to draw fire. The remaining 8 men inside the citadel, realizing they were under attack by a disciplined force, opened fire. The air instantly filled with the roar of repeated rifle fire. Splinters flew from the doorframe as bullets ripped through the adobe and wood. Billy, low to the ground, returned fire with both Colts, moving with a lightning quickness that made him a legend. He was a whirlwind of smoke and motion, hitting 2 men who foolishly showed their faces at the windows. The sheriff's stronghold was a chaotic, visceral scene. The smell of gunpowder, the acrid smoke stinging their eyes, the constant deafening echo of gunfire, and the shouts of dying men. Doc and Tom breached the east wall, Doc using his shotgun to clear the narrow hall, while Tom's Colt covered their advance. They found the heavy wooden cellar door under the floorboards in the kitchen. A single nervous-looking guard stood watch. A coil of rope and a short, sputtering fuse near his feet. "Hands up or you die!" Doc commanded, his voice tight. The guard, Barney, dropped his rifle and threw his hands up, a pathetic look of surrender on his face. Tom rushed the fuse, stamping out the glowing end with the heel of his boot. He and Doc then secured the guard and ripped the door open. "Tanner! Luke! We're Billy the Kid's men. You're free!" In the main living room, Billy was facing the man he'd come for. Sheriff Calderon, a large, heavy man with cold eyes and a magnificent handlebar mustache, was standing behind an overturned desk, a double-barreled shotgun aimed at the doorway. He wore a fancy, too-clean vest and a gold badge that mocked the authority it represented. "Bonnie," Calderon sneered, his voice surprisingly calm despite the chaos. "Always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. You kill a deputy, you're looking at a federal marshal's rope." "I'm looking at justice, Calderon," Billy corrected, his voice flat. He leveled his right Colt. "Slocum told your game. You tried to blow up 2 innocent men to cover your land grab. That badge ain't worth the metal it's made of." "The only thing that matters is who draws fastest," Calderon roared, aiming his shotgun. The air went silent. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by the ringing in Billy's ears and the heavy, ragged breathing of the 2 men. This was the moment of reckoning. Thwump! Calderon fired first, the shotgun blast tearing through the air and missing Billy by inches, shredding the wall behind him. Billy, already moving, unleashed his famous, terrifying speed. Before the smoke had cleared, both his Colts spoke. Crack! Crack! The sheriff staggered, dropping his shotgun. The force of the hits slammed him backward against the wall. He slid to the floor, his fine vest stained crimson, his cold eyes wide in shock and disbelief. Jose entered the room, checking the corpses. "It's done, Capitan. The citadel is cleared." Tom and Doc emerged from the kitchen with the 2 traumatized but alive hostages, Tanner and Luke. "We found the dynamite, kid," Doc said, wiping sweat and blood from his brow. "A close call. Tanner's land is safe." Billy walked over to the slain sheriff. He reached down and ripped the gold badge from the man's vest, tossing it into the fire that was spreading from the bullet-riddled desk. "This ain't over," Billy said, his eyes scanning the windows. "Calderon was the law here. We just executed the law. The real law is coming." They moved quickly. Tanner and Luke were given the few remaining horses. Jose led them toward an old Apache trail, the only path that would confuse the incoming federal authorities. By the time the moon hung high over the mesa, Billy and his gang were back in Red Creek. The town was still. Billy found Ilara waiting by the grave, her silent vigil unbroken. He stopped his horse. The townspeople watched from their darkened windows. "Ma'am," Billy said, his voice soft, "it's done. The sheriff and his men have paid the price for your father's murder. Slocum and Jessup are gone. And the others, they won't be troubling anyone again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the deputy's badge. He placed the cold metal into Ilara's blind hand. "This belonged to Slocum. Keep it. A reminder that even in the lawless country, some debts are paid." Ilara didn't cry. She clutched the badge tightly, her face momentarily softening with a peace she hadn't known since her father died. "Thank you, William Bonney. May God grant you peace for the justice you dealt." Billy the Kid, a man whose life was anything but peaceful, only nodded. He turned his horse. "Let's ride, boys," he commanded. The silence of Red Creek was broken only by the retreat of their horses' hooves. The legend had been sealed in blood and dust. The sun of the next morning brought not peace, but the chilling sound of cavalry on the horizon. The news of Sheriff Calderon's bloody end at the High Mesa Citadel had traveled faster than any telegraph wire. Within hours, a detachment of federal marshals and U.S. cavalry troops, led by a ruthless, driven lawman named Captain Reynolds, was sweeping the territory. Calderon had been a corrupt figure, but his death by an outlaw's hand was an affront to federal authority. Billy and his gang, Tom, Doc, Charlie, and Jose, rode deep into the Badlands, their horses exhausted but their spirits focused. They were now the most wanted men in the Southwest. The $50 bounty on their heads had just jumped to 500, and the territory had become a dangerous, inescapable cage. They took shelter in a vast, empty canyon that offered little but shade and a brief respite from the relentless, brutal heat. Doc Scurlock examined the maps, his brow furrowed. "The marshals are everywhere, kid. They're patrolling the water holes and the main trails. We can't stay together. We'll be too easy a target." Tom O'Folliard looked at Billy, his loyalty unwavering. "Where you go, Billy, I go." Billy, quiet and reflective, sat cleaning the dust from his Colts, his gaze distant. The vengeance for Josiah Clay, while right, had cemented his fate. He was no longer just a reckless young outlaw. He was an enemy of the state, an avenging specter of the frontier. "This is where we part ways, boys," Billy said, his voice carrying the authority of final decision. "They're not after land or cattle anymore. They're after the symbol. They're after Billy the Kid. If we ride together, they'll catch us all." He looked at each of his companions. "Jose, you know the trails better than any of us. Take Doc. Head south, find the border, and ride into Chihuahua. You can disappear down there." Jose nodded grimly. Doc Scurlock, the former medic, offered a brief, respectful salute. "Tom," Billy turned to his oldest friend, his eyes softening slightly. "You're riding with Charlie. Head north towards Colorado. Find a new name, a new life. Don't look back." Tom's face was a mask of pain. "But Billy, what about you? They'll hunt you down." Billy stood up, the light catching the silver trim of his six-shooters. He put on his Stetson, pulling the brim low over his eyes. "They can't catch a shadow, Tom. They can't rope the wind. I'm going back the way we came. I'll make enough noise to draw them off your trail. They'll look for Billy Bonney, not for you." The parting was swift and quiet, a moment of profound, wordless grief exchanged among men who had lived and killed together. The gang, the closest thing Billy had ever known to a family, broke apart, disappearing in pairs into the unforgiving, dusty expanse. Billy rode alone, turning his horse back toward the heart of the territory. He was heading straight toward the sound of the pursuit, ready to face the music he himself had composed in the canyons of Red Creek. He was seen days later, a flicker of movement near a waterhole, then gone. A lone rider glimpsed in the distance, a young man who moved with impossible speed and an unnatural certainty. Captain Reynolds and his men followed the fresh trail for weeks, the chase becoming an obsession, a hunt for a ghost. The only thing they ever found was an empty cartridge case, marked with the unique scratch of a well-used Colt .45. They never captured William H. Bonney. The sheriff's badge, given to the blind girl Ilara, was the only tangible proof of the whirlwind of vengeance that had swept through Red Creek. The pioneers secured their land. The hostages were free. Justice, as cruel and bloody as the land itself, had been served by the hand of an outlaw. In the cantinas and on the lonely trails, the story was told. A young man, barely out of his teens, had faced down the corrupt law and won. They said he had killed 21 men, one for every year of his life. They said he couldn't be killed because he had already made a deal with the devil. William H. Bonney, the boy who rode into Red Creek, vanished. What remained was Billy the Kid, a legend whispered around campfires, a warning to the corrupt, a hope for the downtrodden. He was the perpetual movement in the desert heat, the rider seen just over the next ridge, a fast-moving shadow against the setting sun. He became the very spirit of the unforgiving Wild West, a lawless, violent, and ultimately free ghost haunting the territory he refused to leave.